From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, consider this with Cathy Wyatt, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
If you feel like you've been getting more and more weather whiplash from sudden and drastic temperature changes, you aren't alone. And not only are you not alone, you're right. A recent study found these temperature flips, both from warm to cold and from cold to warm, are increasing in frequency, intensity, and speed. So not only are they happening more often, they're also becoming more dramatic and with less transition time. This trend is partly driven by global circulation patterns like the jet stream and Rossby waves becoming wavier, which can drive these types of temperature flips. Local interactions between the atmosphere and the ground also contribute to how fast and intense temperature changes can happen on a short-term basis.
Hi everyone, I'm Cathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 29th season in this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, weather-ready landscapes. Joining us to talk more about it is John Fech. John is an extension educator for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, serving in Douglas and Sarpy counties. Thank you so much for being here and welcome back.
It's always good to be with you, Cathy.
You bet. Hey, I want to start by asking you to just describe the weather in Nebraska.
I would just use one word, and I would say variable. You know, we're in the transition zone, northern Kansas, southern Nebraska, southern Iowa, and as you look across the map, as we saw in the opening video, that is just prone to variability.
Wow, how would you describe the changes that we've experienced in the weather over the years?
I think we've seen a little bit in the way, but if you think back to, I don't know, the 50s and the 60s, I think just a little bit greater. But you know, in my business, in arboriculture and horticulture, we think about these things every day and the effects they have on different cultural practices we do, and the influence that the weather has. It's an everyday kind of consideration for us.
Okay, what of all the changes would be the most concerning to you?
Probably temperature earlier. It seems like that's driving a few changes for us. Things in the commercial industry, things for homeowners, and people react to those differences. But then again, you get back to whatever is considered normal, and people react to that too. So I think it's a little bit of a change, and it's just something we need to adapt to.
So how do we then approach yards and landscaping? You know, you're saying people are talking about it, and in talking about it, then there is that concern and that wonderment of, wait, it was here, now it's back here, what do I do? So how would you explain that?
So I think we have a lot of what I call gardener impatience, especially when you couple that with, here in Nebraska, cabin fever, and a lot of people who enjoy growing plants don't get to grow plants between Thanksgiving and Valentine's Day, and so they miss it. And so any sort of warm February, March is going to be driving some sort of gardener impatience. And so really encourage people to fight against that, even though it's a natural sort of visceral kind of response. But at least be aware of it. Okay.
Weather-ready landscaping. That is our topic today. How do you explain that to people?
So it's a multi-component effort among all the horticulturists that I work with across the state. And we talk about floods and ice and frost, drought, and just a number of different issues. Hail is another one. And all of those are part of a resilient landscape and can influence whether a landscape is successful or not. And so we encourage people to really use those as tried and true sort of opportunities and techniques in order to create a resilient landscape, a landscape that's able to buffer against the types of extremes that sometimes we see.
Okay, we have a graphic we're going to put up for our viewers. It's key features about what we're discussing today.
Right.
Could you just walk us through those?
Sure, and you know, from a diversity standpoint, if you have all of the same plant, and sometimes I go into some of these new developments and I see rows and rows of all the exact same plant. If something comes in and causes problems, that's going to take all of them out. Something that's well adapted, something that has that ability to go through the extremes. Landscape design from a standpoint of all the key principles of separation of turf and ornamentals, and height and gradation and variability is important. Soil is really the foundation of all successful garden growth, tree growth, shrub growth, turf growth. And a lot of times people want to skip over soil because it's hard to change it, but it can change gradually and beneficially over time. You go to a brand new neighborhood, they have terrible soil. We're going to talk a little bit about water conservation, and that's kind of some of the materials we have in front of us. And getting rid of excess water is one of the key features, because that's a lot of times we see that with floods. Windbreaks, again, another technique that we use to buffer against extremes. And sometimes wind is the big extreme that we fight and can really suffer from.
Okay, so step number one for anybody watching is what?
Basically, it's a thorough review of what you've got and how many of the landscape design principles or even the status of your landscape aligns with that graphic that we just showed. So it's a careful review, and any of the full service type garden centers, a good landscape designer, or of course us at Extension can help viewers really, sort of just do a good look-see, if you will, and see what's lacking and see what's doing really well, what they have in place that's going to be helping them to have a resilient buffering capacity type of landscape, and what they need to bolster. What do they really need to improve upon? Do they have a monoculture? Do they need to diversify the landscape? Do they need some gradation in the landscape? That sort of thing.
So let me ask you, John, as you're talking about people coming to the Extension office or your local nursery, whatever the case may be, what should they bring with them? I mean, it's hard to paint a picture without photographs. So are they putting pictures on their phones so that they can show? Are they describing? Are they bringing soil samples? What would be really good for them as they're coming to you?
That's something I've seen. I've been doing this a long time. That's something I've been seeing over the last 10 years as probably one of the biggest changes, of people are bringing in phones or iPads and showing, hey, this is what I've got. What I really wish people would do would also to bring a sketch, something that's this big, so I could see the whole backyard or the whole front yard or something a little bigger. People generally take too close of pictures or pictures off here when they should really be doing this. Now, don't get me wrong, to visualize has really, really helped. But if they could enhance that, I know a good landscape designer or some of our master gardeners would love to have that bigger, more complete picture of what's going on. Complete with wind direction and soil type and slope. Slope is huge, especially here in the Omaha area compared to like Seward or York, where everything is flat.
Right.
So slope enters into things tremendously.
So what would you say to people who maybe are moving into a new home and they have this whole, new yard around them?
Yeah.
Don't panic, I would imagine, but really what are they looking to do, especially for somebody like you who's asking some questions about history and they don't have it? What would be good for them to think about?
What would be good for them is to take $2,000 out of the drapery budget and put it into compost for the lawn and landscape and vegetable garden, because a new lawn and a new house is going to have subsoil to grow plants on. And I say this as I drive to work every day and I see one of these new developments, and it's big, expensive, beautiful houses going in.
Yeah.
But the soil is terrible. Because all the soil has been dug out from 12 feet down and now then redistributed across the landscape, and it has very poor qualities. And it's going to take 20 years to rebuild that, at least 20 years. I often, it's not polite to ask someone their age,
right.
But I often ask clients, what is your soil's age? In other words, how long has it been since it's been disturbed? And the best soils we have are the ones that haven't been disturbed recently. And so the older neighborhoods, as you go into a community, are usually the best soil. And that's what is kind of the foundation for the healthy growth of all the plants we grow, from vegetables to turf to trees and shrubs.
So that's all part of it. They move into this brand new home, they call John. John says, okay, you've got this new soil going on. We're going to bring some things out that will complement that, versus people being frustrated one year after another because they're just getting the same result with the same soil.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's going to take a long time. Unfortunately, people tend to be very instant gratification oriented when they're in buying mode of a house, and they want to spend money on furniture and drapery and picking out, floor coverings and things like that. But we really should encourage folks to spend some time with the dirt, which again is not real sexy, it's not real exciting, it's not real immediately pleasing, but it's the foundation for everything that will perform in the future in the landscape.
Okay, well, we talked about the key features and then, kind of those first important steps. When it comes to the ongoing, and this may be when your props come into play here, what are we supposed to be thinking about?
So these are essential props, and these are ones that we can look at from a simple and an update, an old version, an up version. Let's start with that.
Okay.
So we've made a lot of improvements. This is a 1970s irrigation device. It's for the lawn. These are impact heads that everyone had, and these have been replaced by these types of devices: smaller, better, more precise, and so that's the kind of thing you want to do. And again, that would be something as you're looking at the landscape. And you're doing a walkthrough with the real estate agent, what type of lawn irrigation system do you have? That's something simple like that. Or if you're not going to have an irrigation system, that's okay too, but don't choose a device like this. This is an oscillating head that will be very water wasting.
Right.
And this one is the same kind of device, will cost just maybe $10 more, but is going to be much more precise and easier to adjust to be more water conserving. The same type of thing here. You can make a lot of advantages here if you'd like to travel. This is a device, this is a simple timer-driven device. Oops.
Oh, you're fine, you're fine.
That you can hook up to your hose instead of having an in-ground system, and that way you can still have the controller sort of aspect to it. You can maybe even hook up a measure, a timer that you just hook in line with the hose.
Okay.
And that's what this system does too. So these are all different adaptations that you can make if you just do a little planning ahead.
So let me ask just a few follow-ups then. So these that shoot the water in the air, for folks at home who have one of these, where do we want to use it in the yard?
They work really well on a windless day. So
Okay.
when is that in Nebraska? But today wasn't all that windy. And if you have a big square area to cover, because they do pretty well at being uniform.
Okay.
But that's the severe, and they're very inexpensive. This is, $8. So that's the advantage of them. Where you have to be more precise, or if you have small areas or curved areas or things like that, then you need to make a change. And then in addition to that, you want to know how uniform the application is. So here we have these low-tech devices here. These are tuna cans. And I think I've shown you these before in the past. And so you just set a whole bunch of tuna cans out in the sprinkler pattern of the vegetable garden, of the flower bed, of the lawn, and let the system run, and then use, again, another very low-tech device and stick it in here and say, okay, I got half an inch out with that running of that irrigation system, as opposed to just guessing.
Yeah.
Because normally when you run your irrigation, it looks wet. And it looks just as wet if you ran and put on 1/8 of an inch or 5/8 of an inch. You can't really tell. You could also use, I didn't bring it, you could also use a screwdriver and stick it in the ground and just see how hard it is to push that in the ground. That'll tell you how far in the water flows. So this is about making adaptations and being resilient. Nice, moist, but not soggy soils are going to help the plants perform so much better in these weather extremes. Again, that's about the weather-ready landscape, is making sure you're doing your part in order to buffer those extremes.
So what about things, I'm thinking of folks who have those straight landscapes maybe behind their house or in front of their house or maybe along their fence line. At one point, soaker hoses were a good idea, still a good idea, and where are we placing those in terms of, for most people maybe it's this wide, but is that just going to depend on what you have in there? What would you say about those?
So there are two aspects of that. And in our graphic, we showed landscape design principles. And then the second one is the adaptation. So the landscape design principle would avoid those spaces altogether.
Okay.
Narrow spaces of with any kind of plant in it are not good.
Okay.
But if you're stuck with it, a lot of times you buy a house with narrow strips in it, like the sidewalk and the street, the area between the sidewalk and the street, or between the house and the next door neighbor, or like you said, the retaining wall or a fence or something like that. So when you have those kind of situations, there are devices, and you mentioned the soaker hose is an excellent way to put water in a narrow strip and not have it go everywhere.
Okay.
Now you might need a tent stake to stick it down so it doesn't go flopping all over the place, or you can use a device like this. This is one of the smaller in-ground irrigation systems, irrigation heads, and sometimes they go vertical, and sometimes they go horizontal, sometimes they go round. You just have to read and say, oh, this one's kind of round. Now, some would be a strip irrigation, and some would be more half-moon irrigation. So, yes, you can make that advice, but the best thing, again, back to the graphic, is to get rid of those odd-looking spaces altogether.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're stuck with some of them, and then you have to adapt accordingly.
Okay, so let me ask one more question then. As long as we're talking, we've covered soil. Are there certain plants, if folks are just starting their landscaping, that are going to be a little hardier, a little bit more weather adaptable? Because I think sometimes a common mistake we make is we see something pretty and we want to put it in our front yard, but that's where all the sun comes in, and maybe that's not good for it. So are there just general rules of thumb for shade and sun, and do you have favorites?
I do have favorites, but I live in eastern Nebraska. And for our viewers in western Nebraska and all over, the extension people would have their favorites too. So I'm a big fan of tall fescue, dogwoods, viburnums, and I try to steer people away from azaleas, rhododendrons, and boxwood, just because they don't perform, and hydrangeas. Someone will call and they'll ask about a hydrangea, and hydrangea is not doing well. And I'm like, no kidding. They're not that well adapted, especially to, now here's a thing about the age of the soil. They do much better in the older parts of town than they do in than in the western or the brand new parts of town, where there's more full sun and the soil has been recently disturbed. So you've got crummy soil and full sun, and this makes it really hard for a hydrangea to do well, as opposed to here in the older parts of town, Keystone, Fair Acres, older South Omaha, North Omaha, places where it's older, more shade, soil is better, and you're going to just have those plants do better.
So those folks watching on the other side of the state, I think this would be a great time to talk about the Extension Office and the resources that are available to folks across the state.
Right, and so we have this program called the Master Gardener Program, which is wonderful. And what we do is we pair people who want to volunteer and immerse themselves, if you will, in all of the things we've been talking about, and then stay busy telling other people about it. It used to be just old retired people, but since then the age demographic has really widened and broadened, and a lot of it had to do with just people's diverse work schedules these days. You know, a lot of split shift, a lot of people working from home, that kind of thing, which has been wonderful. So we have a huge background, or huge diversity of folks from all walks of life, which is great. And so they do a lot of different things. And in our situation, we have 15 different teaching gardens around town. And so they work in the teaching gardens, and then they teach directly from the garden. And you can go and see all these different plants that do well and plants that don't do well firsthand, and feel it and touch it and see what's up. So that's been a big thing. And then all across the state, from Omaha to Scotts Bluff, the same thing is duplicated in all of these areas. And they all have master gardeners, and they all do wonderful things.
Wow, cool. Okay, before we leave this and go on to fireproof landscaping, anything more that you wanted to say about this?
I think the graphic is the most important thing, as those are tried and true principles that people can really hang their hat on. I think it's fun for people to experiment a little bit, but the landscape should not be entirely about experiments. It shouldn't be 12 experiments. It should be 10 good, tried and true, 2 experiments. So I think that's what's going to help people be more successful, because if they have 12 experiments, 9 of them are going to fail, and people get discouraged, throw up their hands, and say, I'm moving to an apartment. So that's kind of the we want to avoid that.
Well, I do want to ask you, right before we leave this, about mulch. We're seeing, especially this time of year, there is mulch on sale everywhere. Are there places you really do want to use it that will help enhance what's going on, and maybe places that, while it would look nice aesthetically, maybe not such a good idea to be putting it down?
Well, and mulch is part of Fire Smart Landscape,
okay.
so we'll do that. But mulch is probably one of the gardener's best friends. But there's good mulch and bad mulch. We don't want rubber mulch. We don't want rock mulch. So we want wood chip mulch, pine straw mulch, anything that's natural and eventually is going to break down and improve the soil, especially for new landscapes. If you've got a crummy landscape, eventually the natural microorganisms in the soil will break down those wood particles and help to put organic matter in the soil. That's what the older landscapes have, is natural organic matter in the soil. That's why plants do so much better there. Okay. So mulch is a gardener's best friend. We don't want to pile it against a trunk. Like if this was the trunk of the tree, we don't want the mulch right up here. We want the mulch starting about 6 inches away. We call that a volcano mulch.
Really?
And we don't want volcano mulches because the soil will come into contact with it, and that bark tends to rot. And just a lot of problems happen when you put the mulch too close to a tree or a shrub. You want to spread it out far and wide in the landscape.
So lesson here, just because it looks nice from the curb doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be doing you some favors.
That's right.
With everything else that's going on. All right, fireproof landscaping.
Well, when you're talking about minimizing damage to structures or homes, there's topography and weather and fuel. Well, we don't have any control over the topography in a fire, and we don't have any control over the weather, but we do have a little bit of control over the fuel. And in this situation, that means plants. All plants will burn. It gets back to that review, a good real good look-see, where you're looking at and trying to distinguish between plants that will act as fuel to damage the things that we need and love. And so you set up zones. First of all, the first zone might be right around the house. We don't really want too many plants touching the house, because then that'll lead the fire to the plant to the house. So that's kind of a problem. It's okay to have an area outside, maybe 30 feet away, that has plants that touch each other, but then there needs to be a gap. So that the fire doesn't necessarily jump from one space to the other. And then there are lots and lots of little things, like where you stack your firewood. Don't stack the firewood right by the house. Stack it, 30 feet away from the house. So as the fire approaches, it burns that and then stops. There's a little bit of a give and take because one of the basic landscape design principles that we all use is plants underneath other plants. So tall plants with an understory of plant. That's how Mother Nature landscapes herself. But when it comes to fire, that's kind of a no-no, because then the fire comes across, hits the low plants, it goes up here to the taller plants, and acts as what's called a fire ladder. And that's a bit of a problem. So you certainly wouldn't want that near the house. You can have that further away from the house, but anywhere that's near something that's valuable, we don't want to have that. So there are lots and lots of little details, and we have information on Fire Smart Landscaping on our website for people to check out.
As you're talking about that, I am thinking especially about the older neighborhoods and the older homes, and those homes that have the vines and almost like growth right there on. So what would you say, because there are many houses like that, what would you say to those homeowners?
Well, again, there's a dichotomy. So climbing plants can be very attractive, but they're also very prone to accelerating the potential for damage in a fire. So anything vertical should be out in the landscape. Like if you want vertical plants, put them in the gazebo, that's out here for when you go out and have an afternoon respite, not up against the house. So it's about location, it's about thinking ahead.
So let me ask you, if someone's watching now, I mean, obviously don't panic, but if you're thinking about having that removed, who does that?
So it's a situation where it needs to be a thoughtful process, and working with, quite often it's a matter of working with whoever is going to replace. Typically we'll have a function or division of the company or something along that line for remediation and removal. So removal and remediate, reinstall. So again, it can't just be done in all one fell swoop. It has to be sort of a step-by-step approach. And that takes thought. It takes, there's a lot of overlapping and sort of almost at odds kind of considerations there. You wouldn't necessarily do that if it weren't for the consideration of fire.
Okay, talking about weather-ready landscaping with John Fech today. While we have you here, I do want to ask for your input, your advice for those folks who are going to be transitioning from spring into summer. What advice do you have for those folks?
You know, it's about planning ahead, and like in the vegetable garden, we want to encourage people to have sequential plantings. To have, if they're planting on a weekly basis, a few plants on a week, like carrots, plant a few of those. There's really nothing finer. The difference between a carrot that you grew versus one you ate in the grocery store, it tastes like a totally different vegetable.
Yeah.
So that can be very helpful, is sequential planting, and that helps you move from spring into summer. And then knowing which crops, which vegetables do better, which grow better in spring, summer, and fall. One of the techniques we encourage people to do is avoid the most pest-prone time. For example, zucchini squash is one of the most ridden by the squash vine borer of all the plants we grow. And that can really be avoided by simply planting later in the year. So instead of planting as soon as you can get out in the ground May 1st, just delay that a month and you should be just fine. Okay,
thank you so much. We're going to put up a graphic for our viewers, folks wanting more information. This website is just a plethora of information, hles.unl.edu. John, I want to thank you for coming back, sharing your time and expertise, and bringing along all your props. We really look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's good to be here.
All right, thank you. And your students, thank you for working so hard behind the scenes. And of course, to all of you for watching. We will see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television in the School of Communication. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call the UNO School of Communication at 402-554-2600 during regular business hours. Or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.